Support for Arkansas Week provided by the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, the Arkansas Times, and KUAR-FM 89.
Hello again, everyone, and thanks for joining us. The maneuvering, the campaigning for the next election's already underway. So what's the temperature of the Arkansas electorate? We're going to check over the next half hour with three people who monitor the mercury. Dr. Janine Parry, professor of political science at the University of Arkansas and director of its Arkansas poll. Robert Coon, managing partner of Impact Management. And he and Dr. J. Barth, Emeritus Professor of Political Science at Hendrix, collaborate on the Talk Business and Politics Hendrix poll. To all three, thanks for coming in and helping us kick off the new year. And I was trying to figure out some way to start a discussion in an odd-numbered year in Arkansas about politics. So let me start with Dr. Parry. We'll start with you. What did November the 3rd in Arkansas leave unsaid?
Well, I'm not sure what it left unsaid. I do know that it was just a status quo election for here. That's the thing that's most striking to me. The presidential outcome looked almost exactly like the outcome in 2016. The congressional delegation held firm in no small part because in most of those races there weren't competitive major party candidates. The legislature actually became slightly more supermajority. And I suppose because the redistricting measure didn't get enough legs under it, didn't land on the ballot, we're going to see more of the same for very likely the next 10 years and beyond. So I think that's the thing that stands out to me most is what a status quo election it was in this state.
Yeah, Jay, Robert, I guess that's kind of what I meant was the news was the status quo, which isn't the news, but it's the news.
Yeah, I think I mean, of course, I agree with Janine that it is a status quo election in general. There were these very subtle, and of course, in an election that looks pretty much the same, you look for anything that feels a little different. You know, we did see in Benton and Washington counties these, two of the best, the counties with the best educated electorates in the state. You did see some shifts to the Democrats. They were single digit, but where you have big populations in those counties, even minor shifts can have some consequences. Conversely, we saw some shifts in the other direction in rural Arkansas, and we have reached a point where it's like these rural counties just simply cannot become more one party. I mean, we're moving into Soviet era margins now in some of these counties in terms of their support for Republicans. And of course, that's where the changes in the legislature came, where a handful of more rural Democrats, and there weren't many left to start with, but the ones that were left are now all gone. And the Democrats, the only place they had any chance of picking up, and they did pick up one, it appears, was in Pulaski County in a more suburbanized area.
Yeah, Jay, if I'm reading the numbers correctly, some of the Democrats who survived out in the Delta in legislative districts underperformed from the incumbents anyway. They underperformed from last time.
Indeed, yeah. And I think it is a story. I mean, around the country, we did see some shifts in heavily African-American districts and, of course, heavily Latinx districts towards the Republicans. We also saw some of those signs here in Arkansas. I think the question is how much of that was true shift and how much of that was low turnout among Democrats in places where there's just not much competition at all. And so I think we've got to do a little more untangling of the numbers to see exactly what the drivers were of those still pretty modest but not insignificant shifts.
Yeah, dig a little bit deeper. Robert Coon, what do you see?
I think the only thing that's really left unsaid is what is Donald Trump not being on the ballot and not being president. How does that change the game going forward? I think, President Trump has really changed the composition of the electorate, both back in 2016 through today. His presence has galvanized Republicans. It's really increase the polarization that we're seeing and Republicans being more emboldened in a lot of those areas that Jay and Dr. Parry both talked about. What does the future hold with him not being in that office, with him, not being on the ballot immediately? And does that have an effect when he's no longer kind of driving the message?
Well, the question has been, you just asked it, not only in Arkansas, but across the country. Is the GOP now purely the Trump party? Will he continue to be the dominant influence over the party in the next 2, 4, 6, 8 years? Robert?
I think in a lot of ways, there's been so many people that have invested into him that in some respects he will be. I mean, he's still, whether he's in that office or not, he commands a following. I think his presence on social media gets attention. And I think there's still a degree of office holders at the national level across the country that are scared of being on the wrong side of his momentum. And so I think he will continue to play a role unless there's some other voice that comes out that, picks up the mantle going forward. I would say that right now that voice has not emerged, and it might be a while till we see somebody else try to pick up the torch.
Well, we have 1, 2, 3 announced Republican gubernatorial candidates already, and to a person, they seem to be doing everything in their power to get as close to him, literally, as they can. Janine Parry.
They do, and that's with good reason. It's not only that he won by such a wide margin again in this state, but it's also that his approval ratings, at least for a figure in Washington, D.C., have been consistently in the positive direction in Arkansas now since 2016. And I think a piece of companion evidence that's really important to consider, too, is regardless of whether it's the party of Trump, so to speak, I think it's really important to note that in 22 years that we've been doing the annual Arkansas poll, we've seen this growth. For the first 10 years, we didn't see growth. And then starting in 2010, we saw this steady shift to people who identified as Republican. And finally, this year, we got our highest percentage of identifiers for Republican and our lowest percentage identifiers for Democrats. And then the independents, who had for so long been, as Jay well knows, the second party of Arkansas, they made that same shift starting in 2010, and it was dramatic. And they also are showing their highest percentage of lean Republican. In fact, we got fewer than 20% of those folks to say, I'm truly independent. So there's this widening gap nationwide, and we're seeing it play out in Arkansas as well. So that's a piece of evidence, I think, that speaks to what those candidates are doing, making sense to an Arkansas electorate. Yeah,
the vanishing center, Jay Barth.
Yeah, I think all of that's accurate, but I also think that it's important to recognize that Donald Trump has really grown the Republican primary electorate in this state, and that has big implications for 2022, where all these candidates are running. It's going to be, I think, it will be the biggest, at least in terms of state politics, the largest turnout in the Republican primary electorate, Republican primary. And those folks are now increasingly from rural areas and exurban areas. And while the plurality are still from Northwest Arkansas and the immediate suburbs and in Pulaski County, they're increasingly tenuous in terms of those more mainstream establishment Republicans hold on the party. This is now a Trumpist electorate, and you have candidates who are really going out of their ways to show their connections, how deeply tied they are to the president. And I think that's only going to continue, even if he's no longer as visible on a daily basis as he's been for the last 4 years.
Yeah, it would seem, Robert Coon, to no small extent, Mr. Trump has defined republicanism.
Yeah, I think so. And I think what was said earlier about independence is really key. You had a long period of time there where you had Republicans, you had Democrats, and you had independents, and Republicans were taking the lion's share of independents for a number of years, 60-40. What you kind of start to see over time is, and what we saw this year is, independents as a group, they may not be 60-40 Republican anymore. And you start to wonder, well, does that mean that they're buying into the other side's messaging? And I think the answer is they're not. they've gone ahead and graduated from being an independent to saying that they're a Republican. And so while the composition of independents looks different and might look a little bit more center or left leaning, it's not because they're changing their views, it's because they're changing their party.
Yeah. Janine Parry.
I think that's right on, and it's something that I've been looking at for so long, and Jay and I have been looking at for so long. We saw what the statewide highest profile election outcomes have looked like in Arkansas, with the exception of the Clinton wins in the 1990s. And we were waiting for it to filter down into these other levels. And it's like we know what you're doing. We know how you're voting when you're being primed with the information about the party's respective positions, at least at the national level. And then in 2010, several factors kind of coalesced to finally, engage that process fully. And golly, did it happen in a hurry.
Yeah. Along with that, have we, and I think I started to see, a friend to all of us, the late Dr. Cal Ledbetter at UALR, he and I used to go back and forth over it. We did it for 30 years over whether populism was being redefined, starting with the Reagan era. Janine Parry, jump in on that, if you will. It doesn't seem to mean quite what it used to mean.
I know, and I think it's such an interesting and important concept, an important idea. Some people would say, right, a brand of ideology, particularly in American politics, and yet it can take both left and right brands, and the policy positions around which it circulates change over time. And no one would have understood that better than Cal Ledbetter, of course. But so I'm not sure how to add to it other than to say that if populism is often associated with a single leader, a popular leader, a kind of top of the ticket, as Donald Trump has been to the right in recent years, I think that it's important to note that while this party has been changing, and while also, by the way, conservative ideology has been changing, mainly by hollowing out those who say they're moderates in Arkansas over this process of the last 10 or 15 years, our positions on the policy issues that I've been polling for more than 20 years haven't moved hardly at all. So it's something about the brand and or polarization and or probably negative polarization, negative partisanship, as we see nationwide, that's happening in Arkansas. It's nothing exceptional. It's just really pronounced here, I guess, because of our relatively homogenous, mostly white and not college-educated electorate.
Yeah, Jay and Robert, the notion of economic issues taking a backseat to social and cultural factors in politics in recent years as the primary driver of public opinion. Yeah, go ahead.
Right, and I do think that we've got this very interesting thing is that, yes, I think it is the driver of public opinion, and of course that then leads to the driver of electoral results at the mass level. But when we talk still at the elite level, we do still have kind of business conservatives still with a great deal of influence over what happens at the state capitol, and of course over the political money, which is of course a crucially important piece. So I think we've got this very interesting within Republican Party world, this kind of disconnect between elites and masses. The question becomes, when does that tension kind of reach a boiling point, and on what issues does it reach a boiling point? And we may have seen it a bit around COVID. I think there are some signs that was a point at which there's been some tension, and it has been, Governor Hutchinson, of course, who's been the lead in Arkansas on that issue, and he's had to really walk that tightrope between more moderate establishment Republicans who want to take moderate action, hence their name, to be conservative but not overreact, versus those who really are advocating freedom that are more purely Trumpist in their worldview.
Yeah, Robert Coon.
I think that becomes the question of how you govern is how do you balance those interests. I think Donald Trump's position on a lot of these issues has put freedom and the word there all over a lot of the responses to how people deal with things like COVID. Clearly, from a populism standpoint, he identified very early, even back in 2016, with kind of the blue collar Rust Belt worker that felt like they were being ignored, and kind of channeled their frustrations. And so I think that's a reason he's been successful. I think that becomes a question of how that, like Jay said, where does that more corporate elite wing of the party, how does it balance itself with kind of what they have seen, which is, this blue collar, middle America worker type voter can be, reined into the Republican side, and how they balance those interests.
Well, we'll start with Robert Coon. What is there a path forward that you see for the Democratic Party in Arkansas? In Arkansas.
I think if there is, it's going to take a lot of time. I mean, Republicans obviously had been the minority party in the state for a long time, and we're talking hundreds of years. So, I think patience is important. I would say, a couple of things. One, I do think nationally, and to some degree, as Jay touched on earlier, in Arkansas, they did do a little bit better in some of the suburban areas. Obviously, urban areas are always a Democratic stronghold, and that proved across the country this year and played into the presidential results. I think suburban areas are the area where they saw some improvement over 2016. Those are critical areas for them going forward. I think what they really, where they failed this year was letting a lot of the messaging around some of the issues that are important to them and the issues important to lots of voters, like police reform and things like that, get way out of control. The whole defund the police movement and branding, really, it's a branding problem. And they can't get behind or be associated with things like that will completely undercut what they're trying to do in suburban communities, because that's going to be a loser for them every time.
Right. Janine, Parry.
Yeah, it's just going to take a long time. I heard some talk in my circles, which tend to be left-leaning up here in Fayetteville and in the academic set. And there was talk about, that if people would just register to vote and we could be the next Georgia. But the reality is we just don't have that kind of population center. And that kind of population center is not coming here anytime in the next few decades. And without that, we're just going to continue to see maybe a few legislative victories, as we saw in the urban and or suburban areas for Democrats. But this is not just going to be a Republican majority state for the foreseeable future, but we're actually going to be, it looks to me, actually was just looking at data like this among the 50 states, we're going to be consistently now in the top 10 or maybe even the top 5 most lopsided states in the country. I was just looking at state house divisions, the ratio between the majority and minority parties. And on the Republican side, only Idaho, Wyoming, and both Dakotas are more lopsided at this point than Arkansas is. And that's really telling. On the Democratic side, it's Hawaii and Rhode Island, I think. So this is our future. That can't be easy for Democrats to hear. It's probably quite satisfying for Republicans, or maybe they can pity them because they were out in the cold for so long. I'm not sure. But I think it's not going to change much for the foreseeable future.
Well, and I would not expect, come January, we've got a legislative redistricting and congressional reapportionment. I would not, Jay Barth, I would not expect a great deal of sympathy to be exhibited by the Republicans toward their loyal opposition.
No, I think it's 140 years of frustration in terms of who's had control of all of the election line drawing. And I think it's going to be pretty emphatic. I think we're going to see it's going to be pretty brutal. I think, especially in Northwest Arkansas, where Democrats have made some nice inroads along the interstate corridor from Bella Vista down to I-40, and there have been some inroads there. But you draw those districts out towards rural areas just a little bit, just do a little bit of slicing, and those become emphatically Republican districts. And that's why Janine referenced it earlier, but that legal decision regarding the redistricting measure that was headed for the ballot and probably headed for victory. We've seen it pass all over the country, these nonpartisan redistricting efforts, and the polling was very good for it here. It made a big difference. I think there may be another effort to come back and do it again, to do another round of redistricting. The question is, could that pass? Because I think there's going to be some more. That feels a little different than doing it just before a redistricting process and doing that in a more what voters do see as a more fair way. But I do think redistricting is going to be something that really locks in these Republican advantages. I think you really, for Democrats, to go back to your last question, Democrats really just have to start at the total grassroots, and that's what Republicans did here back in the post-Rockefeller era, where they were on their way back. They just started at the base level, often with some nonpartisan elections where the brand didn't matter, but the personalities could then set the stage to run for higher office. The other thing I would mention is I do think there's some interesting stuff going on with the youngest cadre of Arkansas voters who do feel a little bit like their peers in the rest of the country. I think we've got a bigger disconnect at older ages between Arkansans and their peers outside the state. But younger voters are more connected through social media and other forces. They're a little more connected. And we saw that, of course, around Black Lives Matter in the summer before there were some, the issue of defunding the police really came online. Younger voters in Arkansas were really reacting to that issue, that moment, a lot like their peers were, white and black around the country.
Let's talk for a second about public opinion polling, political polling, because it was a mixed year, or was it really? Any number of pieces indicated that, well, the pollsters really weren't as off as they appeared, as the numbers first appeared on election night anyway. Janine, Parry, let's start with you. How did polling acquit itself in this year?
Well, this is something that I'm a member of the American Association of Public Opinion Researchers, and you wouldn't believe the traffic, or maybe you would,
yeah, I would.
in the hours and days right after the election outcome. And of course, there's a lot of diagnosis, and equally, of course, it's hard to do, when the body is still warm, so to speak. So it turns out that much like in 2016, we were more accurate than it first appeared as votes were counted. That was even more true in 2020 than it was in 2016. You can go back to that idea, right, of the red mirage and the blue shift, and pollsters and forecasters were correct in that, at least with respect to the presidential election. When it came to the Senate election, however, the one thing that was wrong with presidential polling became even more pronounced. And this is really significant and is the kind of thing that makes us, tear our hair out and gnash our teeth, which is the direction of the error was in a consistent way. And the best analysis I've seen so far, and we're going to need the validated vote studies, et cetera, to come out, months from now when everybody's bored and already talking about 2022, to know for sure. But the best results I've seen are that it appears that, our samples are bad. They're really hard to get good samples, and even waiting now, we can't math our way out of the problem to make the sample look as we think the electorate will look. So now the thing that happened this time was that highly educated, Democratic-leaning folks in most of the country seemed more likely to be willing to join these samples, and even our weighting didn't overcome that result. It's almost as if they're so opposed to this president, they treated their polling responses as a vote, another way to be angry. So. That's the best analysis I've seen so far is our response rates, and our samples have been so poor for so long. And we've been kind of getting by on using the math to solve the problem. But that's just not working the way that it used to.
Yeah, Jay and Robert, of course, the marquee race this past season was 2nd District. Senator Elliott taking on Congressman Hill. And it looked like it was neck and neck. Several surveys were telling us it was absolutely neck and neck. And he wound up besting her by about 9.5, 10 points.
Yeah, well, and those were the public polls, and I think Robert would agree that's also what the campaigns were seeing inside, were incredibly close races. So it was not just a public poll phenomenon, and that's what's kind of. Janine's totally right in terms of the challenges with getting a good sample, and campaigns just have to be really concerned, or the big national parties campaign operations, because how do they're basically, driving blind if they don't have good data. And this is a real problem in terms of how they make their strategic decisions moving forward. That race, I think there were a couple of things going on. Part of it was some challenges with sampling, but I do think there was a little bit of break at the end, in the Republican direction in those congressional races. And I do think it was primarily among these typically Republican voters who just could not stomach Donald Trump and voted for Joe Biden, but rather than kind of voting down the ticket, they did a balancing act. And there is some indication, it's, I think, a little less clear in the second district than it is in some other districts around the country, that's where the break was, and what little bit of shift there was from undecided voters. As they made a decision, they went ahead and hung with the home team when it came to the congressional race.
Yeah, Robert Coon, how do you see it?
Yeah, I kind of agree with some of the things that have been said earlier on both fronts by Jay and Dr. Parry. I think one thing is pretty clear. I do think that Democrats are more willing to take surveys. I think that is not in dispute. I think you are probably missing a couple of points on Republicans. I don't necessarily subscribe to the hidden Trump voter factor that some people say is out there. I think, you can measure Donald Trump's favorability amongst Republicans and in a place like Arkansas, and he's 95 to 97%, popular, favorable. So people aren't afraid to tell you that they're for him, but you may be a couple of percentage points short on the number of Republicans that are in your survey, or they're harder to get, and Democrats are willing to take the survey. So it's not like people are afraid to tell you the truth. It's just, you've got a president who for years has said the polls are a fraud, the polls are not true, and all this. And so, there's going to be some component of his base that just says, well, I'm not taking a poll. I think that's part of it. And I think that if you look at some of the results, particularly the ones that Talk Business and Hendrix put out, pretty effectively measured the ceiling for Democrats in some of those races. I think both, in the Trump-Biden race, I think they had Joe Biden at 33, he got 35. The Senate race had Tom Cotton's opponent at 33, he got 33. So you're not quite there on the Republican side, but you're really measuring the ceiling. I think the same thing is true in CD2. All of the numbers that the Talk Business Hendrix survey had, they had Joyce Elliott somewhere around 45 to 47%. She got 45%. It's that other side of the equation that you just didn't quite get.
Right.
I think that the thing you got to be careful of, though, is trying to overcompensate for what is not there. And there are some pollsters out there that are doing that. They're adjusting their numbers in order to say, hey, there's a piece of the electorate missing, and so we're gonna shift our numbers, or we're gonna oversample in order to get those. And while they may get a Florida right, they had Trump winning Michigan by 2.5, and he lost by 2.8. So just because that this missing vote is out there, you're still wrong if you overcompensate for it to try to cook your numbers for what you think is missing. So it's not clear that really anybody's got that part figured out yet. But I do think on the whole, as Dr. Parry said, I think most of the numbers were fairly close. I think the expectation maybe from the public is you got to be within 2 points of the answer or you're wrong. I think knowing who you think is going to win a state and who wins a state might be the takeaway is, at least you're calling the state right and you're within, you're close, and people aren't completely surprised on how it turned out.
Wish we had more time, but we don't. I got to end it there. Janine, Parry, Jay, Barth, Robert Coon, thanks very much for your time. Come back soon.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching, as always. See you next week.
Support for Arkansas Week provided by the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, the Arkansas Times, and KUAR-FM 89.